house where no footprint stayed, yet someone never left. Welcome to Midnight Confessions. I am your host, Danny. Tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? Your comments make this mystery come alive. Let's begin. The summer morning dawned with the serene predictability for which St. Mary Mead was famed. The hedgerows were freshly trimmed, the church bell struck 8 in its usual unhurried rhythm, and the scent of cut grass mingled with the distant hum of bees. It was the day of the annual garden fete at the vicarage, a highlight of village life, where respectability and rivalry bloomed as abundantly as the roses. Mrs. Dolly Bantry had been up since 6, supervising the arrangement of the cake stall with military precision. "Presentation, my dear," she told anyone who dared come near, "is what separates a winner from a woman who's merely baked." Miss Hartnell, the retired schoolmistress, had already made her opinions known about the raffle prizes. Far too extravagant, really, and not at all in keeping with Christian humility. Mrs. Price Ridley, meanwhile, had taken up station beside the tea-urn, dispensing both scolding beverages and observations about everyone else's failings. Through all this, Miss Jane Marple, sitting serenely beneath the shade of an apple tree, sipped her lemonade and watched. She had a knack for noticing what others never did. The nervous tapping of a foot, a fleeting glance between two people who ought to have none to exchange, the faint tremor in a hand that might indicate more than age. She smiled quietly to herself. Human nature, she thought, never failed to provide its little dramas. It was just past noon when the stillness fractured. A sharp cry rang out from behind the flower exhibition tent. Heads turned. The music faltered. Mrs. Bantry, always the first to act in any crisis, whether real or social, marched forward, her hat bristling like a general's plumes. Moments later, the murmurs began, low at first, then rising in a tide of scandalized fascination. Dead? Surely not. At the fete. Collapsed, they say. Heart, most likely. Who was it? Mr. Denham, the new tenant at Old Willow House. Miss Marple did not rise. She merely folded her hands and looked toward the tent, her blue eyes thoughtful. Mr. Denham, yes. A quiet, courteous gentleman recently arrived from London. Too polished for village life, perhaps, but not unfriendly. A bachelor, though rumors hinted he'd once been engaged, and that the lady had come to a rather unfortunate end. As the local constable hurried through the crowd and the vicar's wife fainted discreetly near the geraniums, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the distant corner of the fete grounds. There, near the gravel path, a patch of earth looked oddly undisturbed, though she distinctly remembered seeing Mr. Denham walk that way only moments before the commotion. The thought came and went like a whisper. A man had walked there, but no footprints had stayed. And with that quiet, chilling realization, Miss Marple knew that what seemed an unfortunate fainting spell was something much darker. The crowd at the fete gathered in small, buzzing clusters, each one its own hive of speculation. Beneath the fluttering bunting and the fading laughter of the brass band, a new sort of tension filled the summer air. The cheerful smell of baked goods and carnations now mingled uneasily with whispers that refused to stay contained. Mrs. Bantry, flushed with both excitement and alarm, stood near the tea table, fanning herself with a folded program. "It's quite dreadful," she declared to anyone who would listen, though her tone carried the unmistakable thrill of one who has just found herself at the center of village history. Poor Mr. Denham, such a polite man, though really one never knows. Does one? I always said there was something rather mysterious about him. Colonel Melchett, who had arrived to supervise the situation with the air of a man accustomed to authority, barked orders in his usual abrupt fashion. "Keep the crowd back, Jenkins. No one leaves until the doctor's had a look. Miss Hartnell, kindly step away from the tent, if you please. This isn't an afternoon outing." Miss Hartnell, affronted, drew herself up to her full height. "I was merely inquiring after the poor man's soul, Colonel. As a Christian, I think it my duty." "Your duty," the colonel muttered, "is to stay out of the way." At the edge of all this fuss, Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting bag resting neatly at her feet. She had not moved closer to the tent, nor had she joined the circle of murmuring onlookers. Her eyes wandered instead to the periphery, the path near the rose hedge where the gravel looked peculiarly undisturbed. She thought again of that moment before the cry when she had seen Mr. Denham walking briskly across the lawn, his cane tapping lightly, his expression calm. Now the grass where he had trod looked smooth, untouched, as though no foot had passed there at all. Dr. Haydock soon arrived, puffing slightly from the haste. He disappeared into the tent with the constable, emerging some minutes later with a grave face and the quiet finality of one used to such conclusions. "He's gone," he said simply. "A sudden death by the look of it. Possibly heart failure." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, half relief, half disappointment. A natural death was far less interesting than a scandalous one. Miss Marple alone seemed unsatisfied. She caught a faint glint of unease in Dr. Haydock's eyes as he glanced back toward the tent. "I'd say it was the heat, perhaps," Mrs. Price Ridley offered, stepping forward with the self-importance of someone whose opinions were habitually listened to at church bazaars. "He never looked a strong man, you know. Pale, thin wrists, always a sign of poor constitution." The doctor gave her a curt nod, but said nothing. He looked instead to Colonel Melchett. "Still, best to be thorough. I'll need to make a proper examination at the surgery. There's something unusual about the way he fell. Not quite natural." That word, unusual, seemed to ripple through the air like a cold draught. By the time the fete dissolved into awkward farewells and whispered goodbyes, the sun had begun to sink low over the church spire. Miss Marple returned home by her usual route, her parasol tapping gently at the lane's edge. At the gate to her cottage, she paused and looked back toward the vicarage grounds. The fete bunting still fluttered weakly in the evening breeze, a garish echo of the afternoon's gaiety. Inside her cottage, she set down her hat and gloves with practiced orderliness, then brewed herself a pot of tea. Her mind, however, was anything but still. A lifetime of quiet observation had taught her that sudden deaths rarely occurred without cause, and that human nature, when pressed, left traces far more telling than any physical evidence. She sat at her small writing desk, gazing out the window as dusk crept through the hedgerows. Mr. Denham had been an enigma from the start, a man of refinement and reserve, who seemed to have come to St. Mary Mead for solitude but never quite settled into it. The villagers, curious as they were, had learned little. He had told the grocer he was retired, though from what was never made clear. He had attended church once, sat near the back, and spoken only to the vicar about renting a pew. Miss Marple had observed him often in the High Street, always courteous, but with the air of someone carrying a private weight. There had been letters, too, she'd noticed, foreign postmarks, faintly visible when he passed the post office window, and once a heated conversation outside the greengrocer's with a woman none of them had seen before, her face half hidden by a traveling veil. As she poured her tea, Miss Marple's thoughts turned back to the fete ground, the patch of gravel by the rose hedge, smooth as glass. A man had walked there, but no footprints had stayed. She recalled the peculiar glint of something metallic she'd glimpsed near the tent when the commotion began, perhaps a button or a dropped cufflink. Little things, unremarkable to most. But to her, such details often whispered truths louder than confessions. A knock came at the door, sharp, urgent. It was young Constable Sanders, his face flushed with the uncertainty of a man new to the business of death. "Evening, Miss Marple. Sorry to trouble you, but the Colonel asked me to let you know. Well, there's to be an inquiry. Doctor says the death might not have been natural after all. Something about the skin under the fingernails." "Marks," he said. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, just a fraction. "Oh, dear me," she murmured softly. "How very unfortunate. Do come in, Constable. You must be quite worn out after such a day. A cup of tea?" The young man hesitated, then accepted gratefully. As she poured, Miss Marple spoke of the fete, of the raffle, of Mrs. Bantry's cakes, of the suddenness of it all. Nothing in her tone suggested anything but gentle curiosity. Yet, as she handed him the cup, her mind was already arranging facts in delicate sequence. A man who left no footprints, a death too sudden to be explained by heat, and a doctor who had seen something odd beneath the fingernails. Miss Marple's voice was calm as she said, "Tell the Colonel I shall, of course, make myself available if needed. I was sitting rather near after all. Sometimes one sees little things without quite realizing their importance." When the constable left, the cottage grew quiet again, save for the ticking of the mantel clock. Outside, a night wind stirred through the garden, rustling the ivy along the wall. Miss Marple rose, closed her notebook of household accounts, and replaced it neatly upon the shelf. She did not write down her thoughts. Not yet. Some things, she knew, were best allowed to settle in the mind, like tea leaves steeping until the flavor was clear. As she extinguished the lamp, a single thought lingered in her mind with quiet insistence. If Mr. Denham had been murdered, then the killer was someone who knew this village well enough to hide among its innocents and clever enough to erase every trace. But in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple knew, there was no secret that could remain buried for long. The following morning brought with it a deceptive calm. The sun rose over St. Mary Mead as though the previous day's disturbance had been nothing more than a passing squall. The milkman made his rounds, the baker's cart clattered down the lane, and from the vicarage came the faint sound of Mrs. Clement's piano scales. Yet beneath the village's serene routine ran a steady undercurrent of tension, a hum of curiosity and unease that no one dared name too plainly. At the High Street post office, a small crowd had gathered long before opening hours. Miss Hartnell was there, her umbrella planted firmly before her like a moral boundary. Mrs. Bantry, too, in her broad-brimmed hat, whispering animatedly with the vicar's wife. And at the periphery, old Mr. Tucker pretending to examine the morning papers, while his ears strained toward every word. "They say the doctor's keeping Mr. Denham's body for an inquest," Mrs. Bantry murmured, lowering her voice only when she noticed Mrs. Price Ridley drawing near. "Marks on the neck, that's what I've heard. Oh, it's dreadful, absolutely dreadful, but you must admit, it's rather extraordinary, too. Imagine, in our little village." "Extraordinary? Yes," Miss Hartnell agreed stiffly. "But not surprising. There's been a decline in moral standards for years. These quiet gentleman types, always the ones you least expect." Now, Mrs. Bantry countered, "we mustn't rush to conclusions. He might simply have fallen. Though," she added, eyes brightening with the relish of scandal, "if it were murder, I shouldn't wonder if that maid of his knew something. Foreign girl, isn't she? The one with the dark eyes, always a bit too secretive for my liking." Miss Marple, who had arrived a moment earlier to collect her weekly post, quietly stepped aside to let the speculation roll past her. She offered a polite smile to Mrs. Bantry, but said nothing. It was her habit to listen, to collect words the way others collected stamps. People, she often thought, were never more revealing than when they spoke about what they didn't know. She noticed the faint tremor of excitement in Mrs. Bantry's hand as she adjusted her hat-pin, the defensive sharpness in Miss Hartnell's tone, even the self-satisfied calm of Mrs. Price Ridley, who prided herself on never being taken by surprise. All these small details, these threads of human behavior, wove themselves quietly into Miss Marple's mental tapestry. When she left the post office, the morning air felt heavier, as though the village itself were holding its breath. As she passed Old Willow House, the scene of such recent tragedy, she paused. The blinds were still drawn, the garden unnaturally still. A uniformed constable stood at the gate, his face set in professional solemnity. "Morning, Miss Marple," he greeted, tipping his cap. "Colonel Melchett's inside with Inspector Slack, taking statements and such. Quite the business it is." "Indeed," Miss Marple said mildly. "So dreadful and so unexpected. Mr. Denham seemed such a gentlemanly person." The constable nodded. "That he did, ma'am. Though between you and me, the inspector's not ruling out foul play. Something about the tea he drank, they say. Cup was half finished and the doctor found, well, something suspicious." Miss Marple gave a soft, sympathetic sigh. "Poison is such a cowardly thing, don't you think? One always imagines the person doing it must have very good reason, or a very poor soul." She continued on her way, her parasol lightly tapping the gravel path, though her mind lingered behind at Old Willow House. Tea, she thought, a half-finished cup of tea. It was a detail that seemed ordinary on the surface, but, like many ordinary things, might hold a quiet significance. By the afternoon, the news had reached every cottage from the high street to the far fields. Gossip had ripened into conjecture, and conjecture into full-blown narratives. Some claimed Mr. Denham had been poisoned by a jealous lover. Others insisted he had taken his own life out of despair. Each version grew more embellished than the last. Miss Marple, meanwhile, chose her own course of quiet inquiry. That evening, she called upon Mrs. Bantry under the pretense of returning a book. The Bantry home was always welcoming, warm light, the faint scent of lavender polish, and Dolly Bantry herself bustling about with barely contained curiosity. "My dear Jane," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, ushering her in, "you must tell me what you think. You were right there, weren't you? You saw him before it happened. What was he doing? Did he seem ill? Nervous?" "Oh, the whole village has gone quite mad with speculation." Miss Marple accepted the offered seat and smiled faintly. "I can't say he seemed unwell. He walked across the lawn with perfect steadiness, at least until he disappeared behind the tent. And then there was that curious business about the path. The ground was quite undisturbed, you know, though he should have left prints." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Good heavens, you noticed that? The colonel didn't mention anything of the sort." "Well," Miss Marple replied gently, "one doesn't always think to look down when the world is looking up, but I found it peculiar, as though—" She paused, knitting her brows delicately. "As though someone had brushed it smooth afterward." Dolly Bantry gasped. "You mean someone tampered with the scene?" "Oh, my dear, I wouldn't presume to say so," Miss Marple said lightly. "It's merely that human nature has a way of tidying up after itself. Sometimes quite literally." They spoke a while longer, Mrs. Bantry providing a torrent of fresh gossip. How the maid, Elise, had been seen crying outside the apothecary. How the constable had fetched something wrapped in paper from the vicarage grounds, and how Colonel Melchett had apparently sent a message to Scotland Yard for expert advice. When Miss Marple finally rose to leave, the lamps had been lit, and the village outside glowed with the muted calm of twilight. As she walked home, she reflected on the fragments she had gathered. Elise the maid, crying in public, the smooth gravel near the hedge, a cup of tea left half drunk, and now, perhaps, poison. At her gate, she paused again, her hand resting on the latch. A faint rustling drew her attention to the hedgerow. There, half hidden among the leaves, something glinted in the last rays of daylight. Bending down, she retrieved it. A small silver cufflink, engraved with the initials R.D. Her brows rose slightly. R. Denham, of course. But what was it doing here, so far from the fete grounds? She turned it in her fingers, noting the faint traces of dirt, the edge slightly bent as though it had been trodden upon. "Curious," she murmured softly. "Very curious indeed." That night, sleep did not come easily to St. Mary Mead. Windows that normally stood open were bolted shut. Lamps burned longer than usual. The rhythm of the village, the steady heartbeat of familiarity, had faltered. And in her cottage, Miss Marple sat at her small table, the cuff-link lying before her like a puzzle piece. She thought again of human nature, its kindnesses, its cruelties, its need to conceal what should be confessed. Somewhere among her neighbors, she felt certain, was a person who had reason to wish Mr. Denham dead. But who? The maid with her tear-streaked face, the vicar's wife, whose name had been linked once, in whispers, with the late Mr. Denham. Or perhaps someone else entirely, someone clever enough to leave no footprints where they had most certainly walked. Miss Marple lifted her teacup, eyes distant, thoughtful. "A house," she murmured to herself, "where no footprint stayed. How very like life sometimes." Outside, the wind stirred the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of roses and something darker, something that felt to Miss Marple like the shadow of truth waiting just beyond reach. The next morning dawned grey and mist-laden, as though the village itself were reluctant to awaken. The air was heavy, scented faintly with rain and the distant smoke of hearth fires. From her window, Miss Marple watched as the postman trudged along the lane, his figure blurring and reforming through the soft haze. Her thoughts were already at work before the kettle had finished boiling. On the table before her lay the silver cuff-link she had found by her gate the night before, polished now and gleaming faintly in the muted light. She had examined it carefully with her magnifying glass after supper, and one small detail had troubled her deeply. There was a tiny, reddish stain lodged beneath the monogram's engraving, too dark to be rust and too fresh to be dismissed. By 9:30, the stillness of the morning was broken by the sound of boots on gravel. A firm knock followed. Miss Marple opened her door to find Inspector Slack standing on her step, his expression as taut as the crease in his trousers. He had the look of a man who preferred facts to conversation and regarded amateur interference with barely concealed impatience. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said shortly. "I was hoping to have a word." "Of course, Inspector. Do come in. I was just about to make tea." He hesitated, as though torn between duty and politeness, but stepped inside. The faint smell of lavender polish and scones greeted him. Miss Marple motioned to the armchair by the fire, and he sat down stiffly. "It's about the Denham case," he began. "There'll be an inquest, naturally, but certain matters have come up that need clarifying. You were at the fête yesterday, I understand, and seated close enough to observe the deceased before the incident." "Yes, I was," Miss Marple replied calmly, pouring the tea. "I saw Mr. Denham cross the lawn just moments before the commotion. He appeared in good health, though perhaps a trifle distracted." "Not ill, certainly." Slack took out a small notebook. "Distracted how?" "Well," she said thoughtfully, "I should not wish to speculate, but I believe he was looking for someone. His eyes were scanning the crowd, not nervously, you understand, but searchingly, and he seemed in some haste to reach the flower tent. I remember because he passed rather close by and he did not acknowledge me, though we had met before." Slack jotted this down with a frown. "You didn't happen to notice anyone following him?" "No," she said softly. "Though afterward, when people ran toward the tent, I recall that the gravel path was smooth. Quite untouched, in fact." He looked up sharply. "You noticed that?" "I did," she said mildly, sipping her tea. "I found it curious. I should have expected footprints, given that the soil was still a little damp from the night's dew. But there were none." Slack leaned back, rubbing his chin. We've had that checked. Turns out the surface near the tent had been raked that morning by one of the groundsmen. Could explain it." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, unruffled, though one wonders why the groundsman would trouble himself to rake it again after the morning rush, when the fete had already begun. He gave her a wary glance, sensing the quiet trap she had laid. "You seem to notice quite a lot, Miss Marple." She smiled pleasantly. "In a small village, Inspector, one learns that noticing things often saves a great deal of trouble later on." He gave a grunt of acknowledgement and stood. "One last thing. We've found traces of arsenic in the teacup Mr. Denham was drinking from. Looks like poisoning, all right. Now, according to the maid, Elise, she served him herself, but she swears she made no other cup, and that no one touched it after." "Poor girl," Miss Marple murmured. "She must be terrified." "Terrified, yes. Or guilty," Slack said grimly. "Foreign type, French, I think. Came with him from London. Hard to say what her story really is, but if she's lying, we'll find out soon enough." After he left, Miss Marple sat for some time in thought, her knitting needles idle in her lap. The rain began to fall in gentle threads against the window. She could not shake the image of that frightened young girl, standing in a strange village under a cloud of suspicion. There was something too simple about the police theory, too neat, too quick. It did not fit with the quiet, deliberate character of Mr. Denham. A man like that did not hire a companion so intimately connected to his household if he did not trust her. By midday, Miss Marple had put on her hat and shawl and set out for Old Willow House. The constable at the gate eyed her uncertainly, but allowed her through after a word from Colonel Melchett, who happened to be inspecting the grounds. "Good morning, Miss Marple," the colonel greeted her with genuine warmth. "I imagine Slack's already been to see you. He's a bit of a bulldog. Means well, but not exactly subtle." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A most determined man, Colonel. I dare say he'll catch his criminal if only he knows what sort of person he's looking for." Melchett chuckled. "Well, let's hope he's looking in the right direction. Though between you and me, this whole affair has me thoroughly muddled. The doctor swears Denham was poisoned not more than 15 minutes before he collapsed. That would mean it happened here, at the fete. But who'd do such a thing in plain daylight, surrounded by half the parish?" "That," said Miss Marple gently, "is precisely why it worked. You see, Colonel, evil often hides best in the bright of day. One never looks for it among the roses." He frowned at that, uncertain how to respond, and she left him to his pondering. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon polish and wilted flowers. A maid led her to the small morning room where Elise sat by the window, her face pale and blotched with tears. When Miss Marple entered, the girl rose quickly. "Madame," she said in a trembling voice, "you are kind to come. They think I've done something terrible, but I swear it is not true." Miss Marple's expression was one of patient compassion. "I'm quite sure you didn't, my dear, but perhaps you can tell me what really happened." Elise clasped her hands tightly. "Monsieur Denham, he was not well these past weeks. He was, how do you say, troubled in the spirit. Letters came, many letters, from someone he feared. I know because he would tremble when they arrived. Yesterday, before the fete, another came. He burned it at once, but I saw the handwriting. It was a woman's." "A woman's?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "Yes. He said to me, 'Elise, if anyone asks, you tell them I am content here. You say nothing else.' Those were his words. Then, at the fete, he told me to fetch him tea. I made it fresh, as always, from the kitchen urn. When I came back, he was speaking to someone by the flower tent. I could not see who. It was behind the canvas. A woman, perhaps. When I gave him the cup, he took it without looking at me. Then," her voice faltered, "then he fell." Miss Marple reached over and patted her hand gently. "Thank you, my dear. You've been very brave." When she stepped outside again, the rain had stopped, and the village roofs glistened under a pale sun. She stood by the garden gate for a long moment, her mind turning over the girl's words. A woman's handwriting, a hidden conversation behind the tent, the tea that no one else touched, and the curious absence of footprints where there ought to have been many. As she walked home through the damp lanes, a thought began to form, a quiet, tentative theory that tugged at her mind like a loose thread waiting to be pulled. She had seen this pattern before, though in another village and another time. Human nature, she knew, repeated itself endlessly, merely changing costume. When she reached her gate, she paused once more, her eyes falling on the flower beds beside the path. A faint mark, a scrape perhaps, showed where something metallic had been dragged through the soil. She bent to examine it closely, then straightened, her eyes bright. The cufflink had not been dropped. She realized it had been placed, and whoever had placed it there had wanted it to be found. The next day was one of those peculiar English afternoons when the weather could not quite decide what it meant to be. A light mist hung over the village lanes, turning the distant cottages into soft-edged silhouettes, while the sun struggled behind a veil of silver-gray clouds. Miss Marple sat by her parlor window, her knitting untouched in her lap, her gaze turned thoughtfully toward the hedgerows. The faint hum of bees from her garden was the only sound, and yet her mind was alive with movement. Every word Elise had spoken the day before circled back in her thoughts like a persistent melody that would not fade. A woman's handwriting, a conversation behind the tent, a cup of tea no one else had touched, and the planted cufflink so deliberately placed by her own gate that it could only mean one thing. Someone wanted to point suspicion elsewhere, perhaps even toward her. But why? Her musings were interrupted by a gentle knock. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and opened the door to find Mrs. Bantry standing there, her cheeks flushed with gossip and the thrill of new information. "Jane, my dear, you must come at once," she exclaimed. "There's quite the commotion at Old Willow House again. Inspector Slack is in a dreadful state. They've found something in Mr. Denham's study, a letter, or part of one, apparently burnt, but enough to cause a stir. You've got to hear what it says." Miss Marple regarded her friend mildly. "I don't imagine the inspector will be pleased to have his work interrupted by curious onlookers." "Oh, nonsense," Mrs. Bantry said, waving a gloved hand. "Half the village is already there. You'll look positively discreet by comparison." It was true enough. By the time Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry reached the narrow lane leading to Old Willow House, a small crowd had gathered along the hedge, whispering in urgent tones and craning their necks for a glimpse of activity within. The constable at the gate looked harassed, but, recognizing Miss Marple, let her through with a deferential nod. Inside, the atmosphere was taut. Inspector Slack stood near the fireplace, examining a small, half-burned sheet of paper laid flat on the desk. Colonel Melchett was beside him, arms crossed, face furrowed with unease. "Ah, Miss Marple," Melchett said with relief. "Perhaps you can make some sense of this. Slack's convinced it's evidence of blackmail, but I'm not sure what to think." Slack grunted. His tone clipped. "It's quite clear to me. Look at this. You cannot keep it hidden forever, I shall tell her everything if you don't come at once." Signed only with the initial L. Doesn't take a genius to see what that means. Classic blackmail letter. And if you ask me, Miss Marple, that maid knows more than she's saying. Miss Marple stepped closer, peering at the letter with calm interest. The paper was fine. Too fine, she thought, for local stationery. The ink had smudged at the edges where the flames had caught it, but the handwriting was strong and elegant, unmistakably feminine. She tilted her head slightly. "It is indeed a woman's hand," she murmured. "The loops are wide, expressive. Someone accustomed to writing often and confidently. Not the sort of hand one sees among the village women." "Which fits," Slack said quickly. "The man was from London, so's the maid. Probably something sordid. A lover's quarrel or worse. He gets a letter, she serves him tea, and that's the end of him." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You do paint such lively pictures, Inspector. But I wonder, does it not strike you as odd that a blackmailer would sign even an initial? And odder still that such a letter would be kept rather than destroyed if the matter was urgent?" Slack's jaw tightened. "You're suggesting it's a forgery?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said softly, "that human nature seldom acts in tidy patterns. If someone wished to make us believe Mr. Denham was being blackmailed, this would be precisely the kind of thing they would leave behind. half-burned but legible enough to intrigue. Colonel Melchett gave a low whistle. "By Jove, you think it's been planted?" She inclined her head. It wouldn't be the first time someone staged a scene to misdirect suspicion. And consider, Colonel, that our supposed victim was very careful about his privacy. Why, then, would he burn his letters so carelessly, leaving one half intact? Slack muttered something under his breath about old women's fancies, but he pocketed the note all the same. Miss Marple said nothing more. She had seen that glint in his eye before, the one that meant he would dismiss her observations publicly, only to act on them privately later. As they left the study, she paused in the corridor, her attention caught by a small table near the stairwell. On it sat a silver-framed photograph. Mr. Denham, younger, with a woman at his side. The woman's smile was restrained, her eyes cool and intelligent. Written faintly beneath were the words, "Richard and Lydia, 1928. Lydia, Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. An L after all. Mrs. Bantry, peering over her shoulder, gasped, "Oh, my word, she looks quite formidable, doesn't she? Do you suppose she's the one who wrote the letter?" "Possibly," Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. "Though, if she did, it might not have been for the reason we think. One must always remember, Dolly, that letters tell us what people want us to know, not what they truly mean." That evening, Miss Marple sat once more at her writing desk, the photograph vivid in her mind. She recalled the conversation with Elise, the mention of a woman's handwriting, the fear in the girl's eyes. If the letter had come from Lydia Denham, then Mr. Denham's past was far less peaceful than he had pretended. And yet something about it refused to settle neatly in her thoughts. Her eyes drifted again to the cufflink on the table, now joined by the burned letter, which she had carefully copied in her notebook before returning it to Inspector Slack. She studied both items in silence. They were too convenient, she decided, too perfectly discovered. There was a soft rustle outside the window. Miss Marple turned her head, frowning slightly. Through the half-drawn curtains, she caught the brief silhouette of someone moving away down the lane, a figure in a dark coat, quick, purposeful. She rose, opening the window just enough to feel the cool evening air. The scent of rain mingled with the faint, unmistakable aroma of cigar smoke. She smiled faintly. Few in St. Mary Mead smoked cigars. Only two men came to mind. Colonel Melchett, certainly, but he was still at the house. The other was Mr. Graves, the solicitor who had recently moved into the old mill cottage. A discreet man, genteel and always courteous, but he had also been the last person to speak with Mr. Denham before his death. "Interesting," she murmured, drawing the curtains shut. "A planted letter, a misplaced cufflink, and a man who smokes cigars walking past my window at dusk. How very orderly." She sat again, her eyes narrowing slightly as the clock struck 9. The rhythm of events was too deliberate, too practiced, as though someone were composing a story and placing props upon a stage. And Miss Marple, who knew better than anyone that real life was never quite so neat, resolved then and there to visit Mr. Graves in the morning. She had a feeling he might know more about Mr. Denham's past and about the woman named Lydia than he cared to admit. The night deepened, and the quiet of St. Mary Mead returned, but Miss Marple did not sleep for a long time. The pieces were moving now, and she could almost sense the shape of the hand arranging them. Morning came with a fragile, pearly light, and the mist that had cloaked St. Mary Mead during the night lingered in soft tatters along the hedgerows. Miss Marple was already awake, as she nearly always was at dawn, moving about her neat little cottage with unhurried purpose. Her kettle whistled faintly on the stove, while her mind arranged facts and suspicions with the quiet precision of someone threading a needle through layers of tangled cloth. The events of the previous day, Inspector Slack's discovery, the half-burned letter, the photograph of Lydia Denham, had stirred her thoughts like stones dropped into still water. Each ripple touched another. and the figure she had glimpsed outside her window the night before, tall, deliberate, leaving behind that faint trail of cigar smoke. Yes, that was a ripple worth following. By 9 o'clock, she was walking briskly toward the old mill cottage where Mr. Graves lived, her umbrella tapping rhythmically against the damp earth. The lane was quiet, save for the occasional call of a distant thrush and the gentle bleat of sheep on the far hill. It was a short walk, but she took her time, noticing things others would overlook: the wheelbarrow marks along the verge, the faint trace of muddy boots leading toward the cottage door, the smoke rising from the chimney in a thin, disciplined line. Mr. Graves answered the door himself. He was a tall man in his early 50s, neatly dressed even at that hour, with the sort of careful politeness that bespoke both education and caution. His expression, when he saw Miss Marple, was one of faint surprise shaded with curiosity. "Miss Marple, what an unexpected pleasure. Do come in." "Thank you, Mr. Graves. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I happened to be walking this way and thought I might call. You've settled in very nicely, I see." He smiled, leading her into a tidy sitting room. "I try to keep things in order. Habit of my profession, I suppose. Solicitors must give an impression of reliability, even at breakfast." Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the mantelpiece. On it lay a small tray with a half-burned cigar resting neatly in an ash tray, its faint aroma unmistakable. "Quite right," she said pleasantly, lowering herself into a chair. "And such an occupation must bring you into contact with all manner of human difficulties, wills, disputes, secrets best forgotten. You must sometimes feel you know people better than they know themselves." Mr. Graves gave a low chuckle. "Oh, I shouldn't like to claim that. One learns to keep one's counsel, Miss Marple. People confide when they believe their affairs are safe in one's hands." "I dare say that was true of Mr. Denham," she said softly, watching him over the rim of her teacup. His fingers paused for just a fraction of a second before resuming their steady grip on the cup he held. "Denham," he repeated, voice even. "Yes, we had some dealings. I drew up his tenancy agreement when he took Old Willow House." "Nothing more." "Ah, yes, I thought as much," Miss Marple murmured. "He struck me as a man who valued discretion. I wonder, did he ever mention a woman? Perhaps someone named Lydia?" Mr. Graves' composure faltered, but only slightly. "Lydia?" He frowned. "No, I can't say he did." "Why do you ask?" "Oh, merely idle curiosity," Miss Marple said lightly. "One hears such fragments in a village. I suppose the name came to mind because of that unfortunate letter the inspector found yesterday. Lydia Denham, I believe it was. The late Mr. Denham's wife, or perhaps widow." His eyes narrowed just slightly. "Yes, I heard about the letter. Most unfortunate. I didn't know him well enough to speak of his private life." "Of course not," Miss Marple said, rising. "Well, I mustn't take more of your morning. You'll think me an old gossip, I'm afraid." "Not at all," he replied, following her to the door. "Always a pleasure to talk with you, Miss Marple. You have a remarkable curiosity about people." She smiled gently. "Only because people are such a never-ending study, Mr. Graves. One never quite runs out of surprises." Outside, she paused by the gate, glancing back. Through the window, she could just make out Mr. Graves standing in his doorway, watching her leave. His face was composed again, but there was a certain stiffness in the way his hands rested at his sides, a small, telling sign of restraint. She had seen such tension before in people concealing things too fragile to touch. When she reached home, she found Colonel Melchett's car parked outside her gate. He was standing on her garden path, looking uncharacteristically uneasy. "Miss Marple," he began, "I wonder if I might trouble you for a moment. Slack's been asking more questions, and it seems this case isn't as straightforward as we thought." "Do come in, Colonel. You look as though you've been pacing." He followed her into the sitting room, removing his hat with a sigh. "It's this blasted business with the letter. Slack's traced the paper to a London stationer. one that supplies expensive personal stationery, the kind used by people of means. He's convinced now that Denham's wife, this Lydia, sent it herself. But there's something off about the timing. According to the maid, the letter arrived the morning of the fete, yet the envelope's postmark places it 2 days earlier. Someone must have delivered it by hand. Miss Marple's eyes lit faintly with interest. By hand, you say? That's quite fascinating. So, whoever brought it was in St. Mary Mead before the fete even began. Exactly, Melchett said grimly. And if that someone was the woman behind the tent Elise mentioned, then she could have been the last person to see Denham alive. But here's the rub. We've checked every inn, every boarding house. No trace of her. Not a soul seems to have seen her arrive or leave. Then she must have had somewhere to go that required no registration, Miss Marple said gently. Perhaps a friend, or someone with a reason to keep her presence quiet. Melchett looked puzzled. But who in this village would... He stopped, realization dawning slowly. You don't mean... Graves? Miss Marple didn't answer at once. She rose and walked to the mantel, adjusting the vase there with absent precision. You know, Colonel, people often think crime begins with greed or anger, but more often than not, it begins with fear. Fear of disgrace, of exposure, of losing something one holds dear. You think Graves was being blackmailed? I think, Miss Marple said, turning back to him, that Mr. Denham was not the only man with secrets. Someone brought that letter here, and someone ensured it would be found just when it would do the most mischief. But if you ask me, the real clue is not in what was written, but in what was missing. Melchett frowned. Missing? The signature, she said softly. Just the initial L. A woman of refinement would never leave her name incomplete unless she intended to cast doubt or shield another. There's an old trick, Colonel, that I once saw in a case many years ago. A letter meant to implicate the wrong person. The handwriting was genuine, but the words were not. You mean someone forged the content? Precisely. The letter may have begun as a plea or a warning and been turned into a threat. Melchett exhaled, rubbing his temples. You make it sound almost as though the letter was written to protect Denham, not accuse him. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Sometimes, Colonel, protection and guilt walk very close together. As he departed, the air outside had thickened again with mist curling low across the garden. Miss Marple stood at her doorway, her shawl drawn close, and looked down the lane where the fog swallowed the view of the old mill cottage. Somewhere in that quiet white blur, she imagined the faint glow of a cigar ember and the steady patience of a man waiting for something or someone to make a mistake. Inside, the clock chimed 11. Miss Marple sat once more at her desk, her pen poised over a fresh sheet of paper. The facts were beginning to arrange themselves neatly, though she knew better than to trust neatness. Human motives were seldom tidy things. She wrote a single line, then paused, tapping her pen thoughtfully. Fear conceals guilt more often than deceit does. Outside, unseen by her, a figure paused at her gate for a brief moment, then moved away soundlessly into the thickening fog. The fog did not lift all day. It clung to the hedgerows like a living thing, soft and grey, muffling every sound, blurring every outline. St. Mary Mead seemed to hold its breath, the usual morning chatter, subdued as though the very air were keeping secrets. Miss Marple moved about her cottage quietly, her thoughts more active than her hands. She had written no letters that morning, nor had she gone to the village post office, as was her habit. Instead, she had sat by her small writing desk, gazing out the window and thinking over the past few days in slow, deliberate turns. Every clue, every action now fit into a curious but distinct pattern, though not one she yet dared to speak aloud. The soft knock that came just after midday did not startle her. She had been expecting it, though she could not have said why. When she opened the door, it was Elise, the maid from Old Willow House. Her eyes were red from weeping, and her hands twisted a handkerchief until it seemed ready to tear. "Please, madame," she said, her accent more pronounced with fear. "I did not know where else to go. The police, they have come again. They ask me questions, the same again and again. They think I lie." Miss Marple guided her gently inside, her tone soothing. "Sit down, my dear. You mustn't upset yourself so. Tell me what troubles you." Elise hesitated before speaking. "They ask about the letter, about this woman, this Lydia. They say I brought it to him myself, but I did not. I swear, madame, I never saw such a letter. I told them so, but they look at me like I am wicked." Miss Marple watched her carefully. "You never saw the letter?" "No, never, but I know he received one. I saw the ashes in the hearth. He burned something that morning before the fete. He said it was from the past, that it did not matter now. I think perhaps it was from her. Madame Lydia." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes kind but probing. "And you are certain no one came to the house that morning?" Elise frowned, thinking. "Only Mr. Graves. He came to see Monsieur Denham early, before breakfast. They spoke in the study, but I could not hear what was said. When he left, Monsieur was pale and angry. He told me to fetch his coat and said he was going out." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "Mr. Graves again. And did he smoke while he was there?" Elise blinked, confused by the question. "Smoke? Yes, he did. Always he smokes those little cigars. The smell stayed in the room even after he had gone." "That's most helpful, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. "Now, one more thing. Did Mr. Denham drink tea that morning before the fete?" Elise hesitated. "No, not tea. Coffee. I made it for him myself. He said tea upset his stomach." "Thank you, Elise." Miss Marple gave her hand a reassuring pat. "You've done very well to come to me. Sometimes the truth needs a quiet place to settle before it is ready to be spoken." When the girl had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long while without moving. Her eyes rested on the faint trail of cigar ash on her hearth from the evening before. She had not swept it away. Mr. Graves's visit to Denham before the fete, his presence at the scene that morning, and now this convenient reappearance of a blackmail letter written by a woman who might have been dead for years. These were no coincidences. And the letter's handwriting, she reminded herself, had been too fine, too measured. It was a practiced hand, perhaps even imitated. In the late afternoon, she took her shawl and made her way to the vicarage. Reverend Clement was in his study, hunched over a pile of correspondence, his face creased with mild anxiety. His wife, Griselda, was arranging flowers in the next room and greeted Miss Marple warmly. "Jane, you've heard, I suppose. Half the village believes we've a murderer among us, and the other half has already decided who it is." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, I dare say poor Elise is bearing the brunt of that, though I rather think she's the least likely of all." The vicar looked up. "You don't believe she did it, then?" "No," Miss Marple said simply. "She is frightened, yes, but not guilty. A guilty person defends themselves too neatly. Fear, however, leaves gaps, and she is full of them." The vicar frowned, confused. "Then who?" "That," Miss Marple replied, "is what I mean to find out. But tell me, my dear," she turned to Griselda, "you attended the fete from the start, did you not?" "Of course. I was helping with the flower judging. Dreadful chaos as usual. Mrs. Price Ridley nearly fainted when her roses didn't take first place." "Quite. But did you happen to see Mr. Graves there?" Griselda thought for a moment. "Now that you mention it, no. He wasn't there until after the commotion. I remember because he came running up just as Colonel Melchett sent for the doctor. Looked terribly concerned, though rather more composed than one might expect." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And afterward?" "He left rather suddenly," Griselda said. "Said he had business in Eastleigh. Odd time for business, I thought." That evening the fog thickened once more, creeping low through the village streets until the lamps glowed like dim golden coins in the mist. Miss Marple sat near her fire, her knitting needles idle, the small clock ticking with calm regularity. It was all beginning to fit. The absence of footprints, the planted cufflink, the forged letter, the too convenient poison in the teacup. And now the early morning visit, the cigar smoke, and the careful lies that hid beneath polite words. When the knock came again, it was sharper this time, more urgent. Inspector Slack entered, hat in hand, his usual brusqueness softened by fatigue. "Evening, Miss Marple. Sorry to intrude. Thought you should know. We've had a development. The doctor's finished his report on Denham. Arsenic poisoning confirmed. But here's the queer bit, it wasn't in the tea." "No, the tea was clean. It was in his medicine. Tonic, he called it. Stuff he took every morning for his nerves. Bottle on his desk, half gone." Miss Marple's eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. "Ah," she said softly. "In his medicine. Then it wasn't chance at all. It was a habit." "Habit?" Slack frowned. "What do you mean?" "Just that the hand who placed the poison knew his routine intimately," she said quietly. "And someone who visits early, before breakfast, might have had the opportunity to alter it unnoticed. Someone like Mr. Graves." Slack blinked. "Graves? I think, so she interrupted gently, "that Mr. Graves is a careful man, perhaps too careful. He visited Denham that morning under the pretense of legal business. He smoked cigars, the same scent that lingered in Denham's study and, oddly enough, outside my own gate. And the letter, Inspector. The letter was a masterpiece of deception. It was meant to suggest a jealous woman, a blackmailer. But it was written by a man imitating a woman's hand, someone trained to observe detail and disguise himself through written word. A solicitor would know how to do that very well indeed." Slack's mouth opened, then closed. He looked both baffled and impressed. "By Jove, you might be right. But why kill him?" Miss Marple looked toward the fire, her voice quiet, almost sorrowful. "Because Mr. Denham knew something that could ruin him, something from the past. Perhaps a theft, perhaps a betrayal. Whatever it was, he meant to expose it. Mr. Graves feared that more than anything. And so, he silenced him." Slack stared at her, his hand tightening around his notebook. "Then the letter, the cufflink, those were all meant to draw us off the scent." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "and it worked, for a while. But people who tidy up too perfectly always leave something undone. Fear makes them thorough, but never flawless." Outside, the wind began to rise, rustling through the ivy that climbed Miss Marple's wall. She sat in silence after the inspector left, her eyes fixed on the dancing firelight. Somewhere out there, the last move in this quiet game was waiting to be played, and she, who had spent a lifetime studying human frailty, knew it would come soon. The following morning dawned clear at last, the fog gone as if it had never been, leaving St. Mary Mead sharp-edged and glistening after the night's dampness. The air carried a freshness that seemed almost deceptive, too calm, too bright for a village quietly bracing under the weight of suspicion. Birds chattered cheerfully in hedgerows, unaware that among the humans below, dark truths were coiling tighter with each passing hour. Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table with a pot of tea cooling beside her and her knitting untouched. She had hardly slept. The inspector's late-night visit had confirmed what she already suspected, yet the truth still felt incomplete, like a puzzle picture with one stubborn piece missing. The newspaper lay folded by her plate, untouched as well, though she had already read its brief account of Mr. Denham's mysterious death. A few vague lines: village tragedy, police inquiry ongoing, unconfirmed reports of foul play. No mention of names beyond the barest, and yet Miss Marple knew such stories spread faster through whispers than any printed sheet could manage. By now, every housewife in St. Mary Mead had likely drawn her own conclusion, and most of them would be wrong. Human imagination was far more dangerous than arsenic, she often thought. It poisoned reputations long before justice had the chance to do its quiet work. She was still turning these thoughts when a soft knock came at the door. It was Colonel Melchett again, this time alone, hat in hand, and his manner more subdued than she had ever seen it. "May I come in, Miss Marple? I'm afraid I owe you an apology, and perhaps a bit of assistance." She ushered him inside with a nod of welcome. "An apology, Colonel? Surely not. You've done nothing to offend me." "Not intentionally, perhaps," he admitted, lowering himself into a chair. "But Slack's been rather, obstinate. He thinks you're meddling again, as he puts it. But I've been thinking over what you said last night, and blast it all, I believe you're right. About Graves, that is." Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea. "It's not often, Colonel, that people commit murder for excitement. They do it for fear. Mr. Graves, I think, has been afraid for a very long time." Melchett nodded grimly. "You'll be interested to know we searched Denham's study again this morning. In the bottom drawer of his desk, hidden behind a false back, we found a small packet, legal papers, old correspondence, and one rather striking photograph. It's of a woman, Lydia Denham, the wife. Younger, of course, but it seems she was once involved in some sort of scandal in London. Nothing printed, but the sort of gossip that ruins quietly. And the name that appears beside hers, on an old trust document, was Graves's." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Ah, so that's the link. I wondered. It's always the past that trips people up, you know. We think we've buried it, but human nature is such that it tends to sprout again, like weeds in spring." Melchett leaned forward. "It appears Graves and Denham were once business partners of a sort. There was a financial matter, irregularities, perhaps, or a misplaced fund. The records are vague. Denham seems to have taken the blame publicly, though the letters suggest he wasn't guilty. I think Graves feared Denham meant to expose him now that they'd both returned to England." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That would explain a great deal. The letter, for instance, was never about Lydia. It was about that. A warning, not a threat. But Graves forged the wording, making it seem a woman's hand, and burned just enough of it to hide its true meaning. Clever, very clever, though not clever enough." Melchett frowned. "Then why plant the cufflink? Why all this theatrical business with the letter and the footprints?" "Because," she said gently, "he knows people. He knows how we love neat stories. A love affair, a jealous woman, a poison cup. It fits neatly in the mind. But real evil, Colonel, is seldom neat. It's practical, frightened, and usually very dull." He gave a grim chuckle. "Dull, yes, but effective. Graves is still free, and we've nothing but conjecture to hold him on. Slack insists we wait for proof, poison traces, handwriting comparison, something tangible. But I thought you might have an idea." Miss Marple set down her cup, her expression thoughtful. "Perhaps I do. But first, we must remind Mr. Graves that he's not as clever as he thinks. Fear, once cornered, often betrays itself, and I believe it's time someone spoke to him in a way he won't expect." By early afternoon, she had arranged for a quiet visit under the most ordinary of pretenses. The pretext was simple, a matter of a will she wished to revise, something every elderly spinster was expected to have in order. She arrived at Mr. Graves' cottage just as the church clock struck 3. He received her courteously, though his eyes betrayed surprise. "Miss Marple," he said, ushering her in. "I confess I wasn't expecting you again so soon. What can I do for you?" "I shan't take much of your time," she replied pleasantly, settling into the same chair she had used before. "I've been meaning for ages to put my affairs in order. One never knows, does one? But before I ask your advice, I was curious about something. I wonder, did you ever meet Mrs. Denham? Lydia, I mean." Graves stiffened, his polished demeanor faltering for the first time. "Briefly," he said after a pause. many years ago. She must have been quite striking, Miss Marple went on mildly, watching his fingers tighten on the chair's arm. There's a photograph of her in Mr. Denham's house. You and she together, I believe. You both looked very, well, young and hopeful. Time does move on, doesn't it? He forced a laugh. Yes, indeed. But I fear that was a lifetime ago. Quite, she said, her tone still gentle. A lifetime, and yet certain things remain. Secrets, for instance. I do wonder, Mr. Graves, what it must feel like to live among one's own lies. I imagine it weighs terribly after a while. He looked at her sharply. Miss Marple, I'm not sure what you're implying. Oh, nothing dreadful, she replied softly. Only that I've always believed fear leaves marks, much as guilt does. Even now, there's a faint scent of cigar smoke in your study. Remarkable how it lingers, just as it lingered in Mr. Denham's, I believe, and on my garden path, the night you came to see if I had noticed something you'd left behind. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock. Graves' face had gone pale. His composure cracked just slightly, enough for her to see the tremor beneath. You're mistaken, he said finally, though his voice was tight. I was never near your house. Oh, but you were, Miss Marple said gently. You placed the cufflink there, hoping I might find it and believe it had fallen during the fete. You see, Mr. Graves, people underestimate the small things. Dust on a sole, a faint tread on gravel, a scent on the evening air. But those are the traces that never quite go away. He stood abruptly, color draining from his face. You've no proof. This is absurd. Proof, she repeated. No, not yet. But I rather think Inspector Slack will be along soon with a question or two about your handwriting. And about the tonic bottle. You see, Mr. Graves, arsenic has a way of lingering as well. His hand went to the desk where his gloves lay, then dropped again. For a moment she thought he might bolt, but he only stared at her, his face hollow with realization. You'll ruin me, he said hoarsely. Miss Marple's gaze was steady, almost sorrowful. No, Mr. Graves. You ruined yourself long ago. I'm only pointing out where the cracks began. When she left, the air outside felt cleaner somehow, the sky bluer. Down the lane she saw Colonel Melchett approaching with 2 constables in tow. She paused briefly, her shawl fluttering in the mild breeze. You'll find him at home, she said quietly as they passed. He won't run. I think he's quite tired of running. As she walked back toward her cottage, the sound of the church bell drifted over the fields. Steady, solemn, inevitable. St. Mary Mead would talk for months, perhaps years, about the affair at Old Willow House. But soon the gardens would bloom again, the fetes would resume, and life would go on as it always did. Miss Marple knew that human wickedness was like the seasons, inevitable, recurring, and always, in its own way, ordinary. And yet, as she closed her garden gate behind her, she allowed herself one small sigh of satisfaction. For in the quiet balance of good and evil, she thought, the smallest act of observation could tip the scale toward justice, if only one looked closely enough. The village returned to quiet in the days that followed, though the quiet was of a different kind, denser somehow, filled with whispers that trailed like smoke behind closed doors. The arrest of Mr. Graves had sent ripples through St. Mary Mead that even the church bells could not smooth over. For some, it was an outrage, for others, a vindication. Mrs. Bantry, of course, considered it all terribly exciting, in the most dreadful way. But for Miss Marple, it was not excitement that lingered. It was unease. Something about the whole business, though tidy on the surface, did not quite rest easily in her mind. The facts fitted too well, like a story written to satisfy expectation rather than truth. She had seen Mr. Graves led away, pale, trembling, but composed enough to offer no resistance. He had said nothing except a quiet, "Thank you" when Miss Marple handed him his gloves, as though the gesture itself had reminded him of the civility he'd once valued. Now, 2 days later, Colonel Melchett came to call, bringing with him the air of a man who had finally allowed himself to relax. "It's all done, Miss Marple," he announced as she poured him a cup of tea. Slacks had his confession. The man broke down completely this morning. Signed it in front of witnesses. Seems Denham discovered some old financial deception, threatened to expose him, and Graves, panic-stricken fool, saw poison as the only way out. The letter, the cufflink, all part of the plan. As neat as you said. Miss Marple smiled gently. "I'm glad, Colonel. It must be a great relief to you." "It is," he said, though he sounded more weary than relieved. "Still, I must admit, there's something rather dreadful about the calmness of it all. No outburst, no protest. He sat there like a man who'd simply given up." "Perhaps he had," Miss Marple said softly. "Guilt often ends in surrender. Once fear loosens its hold, there's little left to keep a man standing." The Colonel nodded slowly, stirring his tea. "Slack's quite pleased with himself, of course. Says it's the cleanest case he's had in months. I dare say he'll be boasting about it until Christmas." Miss Marple smiled faintly, but said nothing. Her eyes, serene as always, gave away nothing of the thought forming behind them. She waited until he had gone before rising and crossing to her writing desk, where her notebook still lay open. She turned back to the page where she had last written. Fear conceals guilt more often than deceit does. And beneath it, she added a single line, "But fear is not always guilty." That night, unable to sleep, she sat by her window watching the faint silver of moonlight ripple across the garden. She thought of Elise, the frightened maid, now dismissed and preparing to leave the village. She thought, too, of the letter, the one that had begun this entire chain of suspicion, and how conveniently it had appeared. Graves had admitted to forging the contents, but he had also insisted the paper itself had come from Denham's own desk. That detail troubled her more than she cared to admit. If Denham's papers had already contained such stationery, then there had been something else at work, something older, buried beneath the current of deceit. The next morning, she resolved to pay a visit to Old Willow House once more. Inspector Slack had finished his work there, and the place stood empty, shuttered, and unnervingly still. The constable at the gate allowed her through with a respectful nod. Inside, the room smelled faintly of dust and wilted flowers. The sitting room remained just as it had on the day of the fete, except now everything seemed heavier, as though the house itself had absorbed the grief and gossip that had followed. Miss Marple moved quietly through the rooms, her sharp eyes taking in the smallest details. The books arranged too neatly on their shelves, the framed photograph of Lydia Denham now turned face down on the mantel, and a scattering of ashes in the grate that had escaped the constable's notice. Kneeling carefully, she brushed the cold residue aside until she found what she was looking for, a corner of another burned letter, smaller than the first, its edge charred, but one line still visible. "I cannot forgive you, but I shall not betray you either." Her heart gave a small, uneasy flutter. That was not the tone of a blackmailer, or of a man seeking vengeance. It was the tone of someone mourning a betrayal that had already occurred. She folded the fragment carefully into her handkerchief and stood, her mind already sifting through the implications. If this letter had come from Lydia Denham, it suggested that she knew of her husband's guilt, or perhaps his innocence, and had chosen silence. But silence for whose sake? As she left the house, she encountered Elise standing by the gate, a small valise at her feet. The girl looked wan and tired, her dark eyes red-rimmed from crying. "I go to London today," she said softly. "There's nothing left for me here." Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "Sometimes leaving is wise, my dear. But before you do, may I ask, when Mr. Denham burned his letters that morning, did he destroy only one?" Elise frowned, thinking, "No, madam, there were two. He said one was from the past, the other from someone who knew too much, but he kept the second until later. I think he meant to show it to someone. I saw it in his coat pocket when he went to the fete. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. In his coat pocket, you say? And what became of it? I do not know, the girl whispered. After it was gone. Miss Marple thanked her gently and watched as she walked away down the lane, her small figure swallowed by the morning light. For a long moment she stood motionless, the puzzle arranging itself with slow, relentless clarity. There had been a second letter, one that had disappeared between Denham's death and the discovery of the first, forged one. A letter someone had taken. That afternoon she sent for Colonel Melchett once more. He arrived promptly, clearly puzzled by her request. Another letter, he repeated, frowning. Good heavens, Miss Marple, I thought we'd had quite enough of those. I rather think we haven't, she said gently, handing him the fragment she had found. This, I believe, is from Lydia Denham, and if so, it changes everything. You see, Colonel, it suggests that Lydia knew of her husband's dealings but chose to protect someone else. And I have a very good idea who that someone might be. Melchett studied her intently. You don't mean Graves, after all? No, she said softly. I mean Denham himself. I think Mr. Graves was guilty of fear, yes, but not of murder. The real poisoner was Denham. Melchett stared at her. You can't be serious. Quite serious, she said. Think of it. He alone had access to his tonic. He alone knew its contents. He had every reason to destroy the evidence of his own guilt while ensuring it fell upon the man he resented most. He invited Graves that morning under pretense, perhaps to ensure the scent of cigar smoke would linger. Then, before the fete, he took the poison himself, just enough to act swiftly, but not immediately. The letter was the final stroke, a forged confession of his partner's crime, designed to condemn him even in death. Melchett was silent for a long moment, the weight of her words settling heavily between them. But why? He said at last. Miss Marple's expression was grave. Because revenge is sometimes the only comfort left to the ruined. Denham had lost everything, his reputation, his fortune, his wife's affection. And yet, he found one way to control the story of his own end. Graves was to bear the punishment he himself had escaped years ago. A most human sort of justice. Cruel, final, and terribly logical. The colonel rubbed his forehead. Good Lord, Miss Marple, you think we've arrested the wrong man. I'm quite sure of it, she said quietly. And unless we act soon, Mr. Graves will pay for a crime that never needed punishment, because its author has already met his. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat once more in her garden, the scent of honeysuckle heavy in the still air. The truth had finally taken its shape, not clean, not simple, but undeniably human. And as she watched the last light fade, she thought, not without sadness, that in the end there were no villains or heroes in this story. Only souls undone by pride and fear, each trapped within their own quiet tragedy. The revelation hung between them like a slow-turning shadow. Colonel Melchett sat stiffly in his chair, staring at Miss Marple as though her words had unseated something deep within him. The faint ticking of the clock filled the silence that followed, steady, almost accusatory. Outside, a blackbird sang somewhere in the garden, oblivious to the weight pressing down on the room. Good Lord, Melchett muttered finally, rubbing his temples. You're saying Denham killed himself to frame Graves? That he planned it all? I believe so, Miss Marple said quietly. He had the means, the mind, and most certainly the motive. He wanted to destroy Mr. Graves, not with scandal, but with punishment. To let the man live on, branded a murderer, would have been, to Denham's way of thinking, the perfect justice. It would have appealed to that cool, deliberate temperament he hid beneath all that gentlemanly charm. Melchett frowned, pacing the small sitting room. But the confession, the letter we found, the false one Graves forged, it fits Denham's plan too neatly. It almost confirms his guilt." Miss Marple nodded. "And that, Colonel, is precisely what troubles me. Graves' forgery was based on a real letter. That means Denham left it behind deliberately, perhaps even arranged it to be found. He needed Graves' fear to complete the illusion. He counted on him to panic, to do something foolish. And Mr. Graves, being a man of conscience but little courage, did exactly that." Melchett stopped pacing, his brow furrowed in thought. "Then Denham's death wasn't an act of desperation, it was an act of design." "Precisely. A performance, carefully rehearsed. He mixed the poison into his tonic, knowing he'd take it that morning as usual. He would have felt the first symptoms, dizziness, nausea, at the fete, just as the village gathered. And in those final moments, he arranged the scene to point where he wanted it to point, toward Mr. Graves. The letter, the smooth path, the absence of footprints. All calculated. He'd have brushed the gravel himself to erase his own steps, creating the illusion of someone unseen. That, you see, was his genius. He made himself into the ghost of his own revenge." The Colonel let out a low whistle. "And all this over a business matter that happened years ago?" Miss Marple gave a small sigh. "One must never underestimate the bitterness of humiliation. Denham took the blame for Graves's actions once before. I imagine he forgave it at the time, or believed he had. But resentment is like poison, Colonel. It may lie dormant for years, only to act when one least expects it." Melchett sank back into his chair, shaking his head. "We'll have to reopen the case. Graves must be released at once. Slack will be furious." "Better furious than unjust," Miss Marple said softly. "And you must handle it quietly. If the village knew the truth, that Mr. Denham took his own life for revenge, it would only breed more pity for the wrong man and gossip about the dead. Best let them believe the matter resolved. The law will know the truth, and that will be enough." The Colonel looked at her for a long moment. "You're right, as always. Though I must say, you do make one wonder how many such tragedies are buried beneath the calm surface of English respectability." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, my dear Colonel, far more than anyone suspects. People imagine wickedness wears a dramatic face, but it rarely does. It looks rather ordinary, rather polite, in fact." When he left, she walked him to the door, the air outside still heavy with late summer heat. The garden shimmered faintly under the low sun, and the church bells in the distance marked the hour with quiet dignity. She stood there for a while, her eyes following him down the lane until he vanished behind the hedge, then turned back into the house. Her sitting room seemed smaller now, filled with the hush that follows the end of something inevitable. On the table lay the small fragment of Lydia's letter, the line that had changed everything. Miss Marple smoothed it with her fingertips, reading it again as though to confirm it still said what it did. "I cannot forgive you, but I shall not betray you either." That single line had revealed the truth. Lydia had known of Denham's plan. She had understood the depth of his anger and the scope of his deceit, yet had chosen silence. Perhaps she still loved him in some way, or perhaps she feared the scandal his exposure would bring. Miss Marple, who knew human hearts better than most, suspected it was a mixture of both. Love and pride, those old companions of tragedy, had kept Lydia quiet, and in her silence lay the seed of the final act. That evening, as the light dimmed, Miss Marple prepared her simple supper, soup, bread, a slice of cheese, and thought about the strange fragility of moral balance. Denham's sin had been deliberate, but Graves had been cowardice, and which she wondered was truly the greater fault, the one who acts upon evil or the one who allows fear to make him complicit in it. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Elise standing there again, though she had sworn she would leave for London. The girl looked uncertain, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "Forgive me, madame," she said, her voice trembling. "I had to come. The colonel, he told me that Mr. Graves will be freed. They say it was not he who killed Monsieur Denham. But I must ask, how can that be? Who else could have done such a thing?" Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "It was Mr. Denham himself, my dear." Elise blinked, stunned. "Himself? But why?" "For revenge," Miss Marple said softly. "He wanted to destroy the man who had wronged him once. But in the end, he destroyed only himself." The girl's eyes filled with tears. "He was not a wicked man, madame. He was sad, always sad. I think he wanted to die." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "But he wanted to be remembered as wronged, not as broken. That, I think, was the tragedy." Elise wept quietly for a few moments, and Miss Marple let her, offering a handkerchief without a word. When the girl had gone, Miss Marple remained standing at the door, looking out at the night. The moon hung low, and the village beyond lay peaceful once more, the sort of peace that always followed storm. Yet beneath it she sensed the faint, enduring hum of human folly, the same tune that had played through every case she had ever known. The following day brought news that confirmed everything. The coroner, having reviewed the new evidence and the toxicologist's findings, declared Denham's death self-inflicted. Graves was released quietly, his name cleared but his spirit dimmed. He left St. Mary Mead within the week, leaving behind only an empty cottage and a faint scent of cigars that lingered longer than memory. Life resumed its rhythm. The fete was spoken of less often. Conversations returned to gardens and weather and the scandalous price of butter. But sometimes, as Miss Marple took her afternoon walk past Old Willow House, she would pause by the gate where the gravel path lay smooth and even once more. The roses had begun to bloom again, soft and full, their scent sweet but somehow melancholy. She would stand there a moment, thinking of the man who had walked across that path and left no trace, neither footprints nor forgiveness, and then she would move on, her steps slow but steady, her eyes bright with the quiet understanding of one who had long accepted that human hearts, like gardens, always conceal more than they reveal. And that evening, back in her cottage, as she sat knitting by the window, she murmured softly to herself, "The house where no footprint stayed. But the heart, it remembers every step." The clock chimed 8. The needles clicked rhythmically in her hands, and in the calm stillness of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple smiled, gentle, wistful, and entirely certain that, as always, truth had found its way home at last. The following weeks passed with a deceptive calm that only deepened the sense of unease beneath it. St. Mary Mead had resumed its habitual rhythm, the church bells, the chatter at the post office, the polite nods exchanged over garden fences, but the recent events had left a faint shadow across the village. People spoke of Mr. Denham's death less frequently now, as though by refusing to name it, they could return life to its rightful order. Yet, when the evening light slanted across the green or a sudden silence fell in the middle of conversation, one could feel it still, the strange, lingering chill of what had been uncovered. Miss Marple felt it too, though she never said so. She went about her days as always, tending her garden, writing her notes, taking tea with Mrs. Bantry, who had not yet grown weary of the story. But Miss Marple's thoughts, though calm on the surface, stirred with quiet motion underneath. There was something about Denham's final act that refused to settle, something beyond mere revenge. It was too coldly precise, too deliberate. Revenge, she thought, was a hot emotion. It burned quickly, then guttered out. Denham's scheme had been crafted with patience, the kind that suggested not passion, but purpose. It was one such afternoon when a letter arrived. The handwriting was elegant, foreign in its slant, and the paper thick and cream-colored. The postmark read, Paris. Miss Marple broke the seal carefully. Inside was a short note written in firm, deliberate strokes. Dear Miss Marple, you do not know me, but I was once the wife of Richard Denham. Word of his death reached me through the papers, and of your role in uncovering the truth. I wish to thank you for seeing him clearly, though I fear no one ever did. Not even I. There is, however, one thing more that you should know. Richard's death was not merely an act of revenge, but the conclusion of a promise made long ago to protect someone else at any cost. If you find yourself wondering who that person was, look not to the past, but to what was left undone. You will understand when you see it, with gratitude and sorrow, Lydia Denham. Miss Marple read the letter twice, then set it down beside her tea, her expression thoughtful. The words were graceful, yet carefully measured. Lydia Denham was not a woman who wrote impulsively. There was truth in that letter, but also a challenge. Look not to the past, but to what was left undone. What could that mean? She rose from her chair and crossed to her bookshelf, where her small ledger of village events was kept. It was a habit of hers, that book, a record of small occurrences, births, deaths, weddings, the odd scandal, all noted with the gentle curiosity of someone who found human behavior endlessly instructive. Turning to the pages that covered the past month, she reviewed her entries. Fate, Denham's collapse, Graves' arrest and release, Elise's departure. Each line was neat, precise, as she preferred all things to be. Yet, as her finger traced the dates, she paused. Elise's departure, she had written it down as left for London, 3rd September. But had she truly gone? A curious thought stirred. Miss Marple remembered Elise's second visit, the night she came weeping to her door. The girl had spoken with conviction, yes, but there had been something unfinished in her manner, as though she carried a secret she could neither reveal nor bury. And now Lydia Denham's letter, with its strange suggestion of protection, protect someone else at any cost. The next morning, she went to the station under the pretense of posting a parcel. Mr. Pritchard, the station master, greeted her with his usual affable nod. "Morning, Miss Marple. Off to send something, are you?" "Yes, indeed," she said pleasantly. "I was wondering, though, did a Miss Elise Fournier depart on the 3rd as expected? Young French girl from Old Willow House?" Mr. Pritchard frowned, consulting his ledger. "Let me see now. 3rd of September, you say?" "No, can't say she did. There was no one by that name on the morning train to London, or the afternoon one, for that matter. I'd have remembered. She had quite a look about her, that girl." "I see," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes brightening just slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Pritchard. You've been most helpful." She walked home slowly, her parasol tapping the gravel in thoughtful rhythm. So Elise had not left. Why lie about such a thing? Fear, perhaps, or loyalty. And if Lydia Denham's letter was to be believed, Richard's final act had been meant to protect someone living, not dead. Could it be that Elise was more than merely his servant? The possibility, though not shocking to Miss Marple's seasoned mind, opened an entirely new thread of thought. Later that day, as dusk began to fall, and the last of the sunlight brushed the tops of the trees, a shadow moved across Miss Marple's garden. The knock at her door was soft but urgent. When she opened it, Elise stood there again, pale, trembling, her eyes darting nervously toward the road. "Madame," she whispered, "please, I cannot stay long. They must not know I came." "Who mustn't?" Miss Marple asked gently, stepping aside to let her in. Elise hesitated before entering, her hands twisting together. "I should have left, yes, but I could not. There is something I must tell you, something I should have said before. Monsieur Denham, he did not wish for revenge. Not at first. He wanted only to keep a promise. To protect me." Miss Marple regarded her with calm understanding. "Protect you, my dear? From what?" Tears welled in Elise's eyes. "From the law, from disgrace. I am not who they think I am. I am his daughter, For a long moment, the room was utterly still. Even the ticking clock seemed to pause. Miss Marple studied the girl's face. So young, so frightened, and in that face she saw it. The shape of the eyes, the delicate line of the chin, the unmistakable resemblance to the photograph she had seen of Lydia Denham in her youth. "I see," Miss Marple said quietly. "So Lydia was your mother?" Elise nodded, choking back a sob. "She sent me here when I was small, to England. To him, but no one must know. There were, things in the past. He said it would ruin her if anyone learned. That is why he took the blame for Mr. Graves's crime. He thought he could bear it, but it destroyed him inside, and when he saw that they might expose it again, he decided." She covered her face with her hands. Miss Marple moved closer, her voice gentle. "He decided to die on his own terms, to protect you still." Elise nodded, weeping silently. "He made me promise to say nothing. He said if anyone asked, I was only a servant. But when they accused me, oh, madame, I could not speak. I could not betray him, not even to save myself." Miss Marple placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You did what you believed right, my dear, and I think your father would have understood that better than anyone." The girl wept quietly for a while longer, then rose. "I will leave tonight," she said, "for France. My mother waits for me. She said when it was all finished I must come home." Miss Marple nodded. "Go, child. There is nothing for you here now but memories." After Elise had gone, Miss Marple stood by the window, watching as the faint figure disappeared into the gathering dusk. The sky was streaked with rose and gold, fading into the soft violet of evening. She felt no triumph in what she had learned, only the melancholy satisfaction of understanding the full measure of a human heart's complexity. Denham's death, she realized now, had not been vengeance at all. It had been sacrifice, a desperate act of love from a man who had lost everything but the one secret he could still keep. As darkness settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple lit her lamp and sat once more at her desk. She opened her notebook to a clean page and wrote slowly, carefully. In the end, no crime begins or ends with malice alone. There is always love somewhere within it, warped, wounded, or misunderstood. And that is what makes it so terribly human. She closed the book, set down her pen, and gazed into the soft lamplight, her expression serene but tinged with sorrow. Outside, the night deepened, and somewhere beyond the hedgerows, a train whistle sounded, a distant, mournful note carrying away the last remnant of a story that had begun with silence and ended in understanding. The house where no footprint stayed was quiet once more, and Miss Marple, who knew that even quiet had its own language, listened to it with the still, patient grace of one who understood that justice and mercy were rarely as far apart as they seemed. ChatGPT said, "The days that followed passed with a sense of quiet renewal. The autumn sun lay soft upon the village, gilding the rooftops and hedgerows, and St. Mary Mead seemed, once again, to breathe easily. The scandal that had shadowed its calm had begun to fade, as all scandals eventually did. A new family was already preparing to lease Old Willow House. People who knew nothing of the tragedy, nor of the man whose life and death had left so many questions lingering in the hearts of those who remained. Miss Marple, however, remembered everything. She always did. It was not in her nature to forget. Not the crimes, nor the pain behind them. But she carried remembrance with a gentle sort of dignity, never bitterly. She understood that life, much like the gardens she so loved, grew tangled at the roots, that weeds and roses often sprang from the same soil. Colonel Melchett came to see her one final time about the matter, his manner subdued but thoughtful. "It's all been settled now," he said, standing by her little gate, hat in hand. "The French authorities confirmed it. The girl, Elise, is safe with her mother in Paris. No charges, of course. Graves has gone north, I hear, to start afresh. A man like that, I suppose, will always be haunted by what might have been. Miss Marple nodded. We all are, in one way or another. He sighed. Funny thing, though. I keep thinking about Denham. You'd expect to despise a man like that, wouldn't you? But I can't. To do what he did, terrible, yes, but somehow pitiable too. He was so determined to protect his secret, his daughter, and yet it destroyed him. Human nature is full of contradictions, Miss Marple said gently. He wanted to shield her from disgrace, and in doing so, ensured that his own soul never found peace. It's a sad business, Colonel. Most wickedness, you know, comes from a wish to do good, only done the wrong way. He looked at her, faintly smiling. You really do see the world differently, Miss Marple. I envy that. I simply watch, Colonel, she replied, with that modest smile of hers. People show you everything, if you let them. A glance, a tone of voice. It's all there, waiting to be understood. The trouble is, most people look only at what they expect to see. He chuckled softly, tipping his hat. Well, I expect I've learned something from you this time, though heaven help me if I ever find myself the subject of your observations. Then you must behave yourself, she said, her eyes twinkling. When he left, Miss Marple went inside and set a fresh pot of tea to steep. She stood by the window, gazing out at her garden, the hollyhocks still standing proud, though autumn had begun to turn their colors dull. A robin hopped across the path, and she watched it absently, her thoughts drifting. There had been so much sorrow in this affair, and yet, within it, a strange sort of grace. Denham had sinned through pride, yes, but he had also loved deeply. Lydia had remained silent, not from cowardice, but from loyalty. And Elise, the innocent at the heart of it all, had learned the cost of love's secrecy in the hardest way. Miss Marple felt certain she would grow stronger for it. Life had a way of mending what seemed beyond repair, slowly, quietly, but always with purpose. She sat down at her writing desk and opened her notebook one last time. On the final page, beneath her previous reflections, she wrote, Truth seldom shouts. It whispers, waiting for patient ears. And when at last it is heard, it brings not triumph, but understanding. She closed the book and placed it neatly upon the shelf, her small act of finality. The matter was done. The story of the house where no footprint stayed had found its ending, not in condemnation, but in comprehension. Outside, the church bells began to ring for evening service. Their sound carried across the fields, soft and steady, blending with the hum of bees returning to their hives. Miss Marple stood, put on her shawl, and stepped out into the fading light. She walked slowly down the lane toward the church, her step sure, her figure small against the golden dusk. As she passed the garden gate, she paused, glancing once toward the distant roof of old Willow House, now empty but peaceful. The ivy still climbed its walls, the windows glimmered faintly in the sun, and the air seemed to hold a strange, forgiving stillness. Rest easy, Mr. Denham, she murmured softly, almost as if he might still hear her. Your secret's safe at last. Then she turned, her shawl fluttering lightly in the evening breeze, and made her way toward the sound of the bells, leaving behind her another solved mystery, another quiet triumph of observation and compassion, the kind that only Miss Marple, with her gentle eyes and unerring wisdom, could bring to light. And in the stillness that followed, St. Mary Mead exhaled once more, its peace restored, its truth quietly buried beneath the surface of everyday life, just as it always had been and always would be. ChatGPT can make mistakes. OpenAI doesn't use Amir's workspace data to train its models. ChatGPT says, the days that followed passed with a sense of quiet renewal. The autumn sun lay soft upon the village, gilding the rooftops and hedgerows, and St. Mary Mead seemed once again to breathe easily. The scandal that had shadowed its calm had begun to fade, as all scandals eventually did. A new family was already preparing to lease Old Willow House. People who knew nothing of the tragedy, nor of the man whose life and death had left so many questions lingering in the hearts of those who remained. Miss Marple, however, remembered everything. She always did. It was not in her nature to forget, not the crimes nor the pain behind them, but she carried remembrance with a gentle sort of dignity, never bitterly. She understood that life, much like the gardens she so loved, grew tangled at the roots, that weeds and roses often sprang from the same soil. Colonel Melchett came to see her one final time about the matter, his manner subdued but thoughtful. "It's all been settled now," he said, standing by her little gate, hat in hand. "The French authorities confirmed it. The girl, Elise, is safe with her mother in Paris. No charges, of course. Graves has gone north, I hear, to start afresh. A man like that, I suppose, will always be haunted by what might have been." Miss Marple nodded. "We all are, in one way or another." He sighed. "Funny thing, though. I keep thinking about Denham. You'd expect to despise a man like that, wouldn't you? But I can't. To do what he did. Terrible, yes, but somehow pitiable, too. He was so determined to protect his secret, his daughter, and yet it destroyed him. Human nature is full of contradictions," Miss Marple said gently. He wanted to shield her from disgrace, and in doing so, ensured that his own soul never found peace. "It's a sad business, Colonel. Most wickedness, you know, comes from a wish to do good, only done the wrong way." He looked at her, faintly smiling. "You really do see the world differently, Miss Marple. I envy that." "I simply watch, Colonel," she replied with that modest smile of hers. "People show you everything if you let them. A glance, a tone of voice. It's all there, waiting to be understood. The trouble is, most people look only at what they expect to see." He chuckled softly, tipping his hat. "Well, I expect I've learned something from you this time, though heaven help me if I ever find myself the subject of your observations." "Then you must behave yourself," she said, her eyes twinkling. When he left, Miss Marple went inside and set a fresh pot of tea to steep. She stood by the window, gazing out at her garden, the hollyhocks still standing proud, though autumn had begun to turn their colors dull. A robin hopped across the path, and she watched it absently, her thoughts drifting. There had been so much sorrow in this affair, and yet, within it, a strange sort of grace. Denham had sinned through pride, yes, but he had also loved deeply. Lydia had remained silent, not from cowardice, but from loyalty. And Elise, the innocent at the heart of it all, had learned the cost of love's secrecy in the hardest way. Miss Marple felt certain she would grow stronger for it. Life had a way of mending what seemed beyond repair, slowly, quietly, but always with purpose. She sat down at her writing desk and opened her notebook one last time. On the final page, beneath her previous reflections, she wrote, "Truth seldom shouts. It whispers, waiting for patient ears, and when at last it is heard, it brings not triumph, but understanding." She closed the book and placed it neatly upon the shelf, her small act of finality. The matter was done. The story of the house where no footprint stayed had found its ending, not in condemnation, but in comprehension. Outside, the church bells began to ring for evening service, their sound carried across the fields, soft and steady, blending with the hum of bees returning to their hives. Miss Marple stood, put on her shawl, and stepped out into the fading light. She walked slowly down the lane toward the church, her step sure, her figure small against the golden dusk. As she passed the garden gate, she paused, glancing once toward the distant roof of Old Willow House, now empty but peaceful. The ivy still climbed its walls, the windows glimmered faintly in the sun, and the air seemed to hold a strange, forgiving stillness. "Rest easy, Mr. Denham," she murmured softly, almost as if he might still hear her. "Your secret's safe at last." Then she turned, her shawl fluttering lightly in the evening breeze, and made her way toward the sound of the bells, leaving behind her another solved mystery, another quiet triumph of observation and compassion, the kind that only Miss Marple, with her gentle eyes and unerring wisdom, could bring to light. And in the stillness that followed, St. Mary Mead exhaled once more, its peace restored, its truth quietly buried beneath the surface of everyday life, just as it always had been, and always would be, 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 and always